The topic in consideration, data protection regime. I think there have been a much deliberation on data protection, and FITIS 2 has facilitated many forums, dialogues before with regard to the aspects of data protection. But however, this discussion is with regard to its special focus on how the corporates in Sri Lanka would future-proof themselves with regard to the Data Protection Act, its enactment in Sri Lanka, etc. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce our eminent panelists, basically starting off from Mr. Jayantha Fernando. Mr. Jayantha Fernando has over 25 years experience in a range of ICT and legal policy issues. He has specialized in his master's in degree in telecommunications and internet law. He pioneered drafting of several legislation impacting digital transformation, electronic transaction, digital mobile payments, cybersecurity, and data protection. He led Sri Lanka's entry into Budapest Cyber Crime Convention in 2015 and the UN Electronic Communications Convention also in 2015, both first for South Asia, for that matter. At present, he is the General Counsel of ICTA. In addition, Mr. Jayantha Fernando is the founder director of Sri Lanka CERT. He also served as its chairman until 2019. Mr. Fernando was a director and past chairman of .lk Domain Name Registry, a former commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission Sri Lanka, and a director of the Colombo Stock Exchange. He drafted the legal framework for the use of digital signatures for the banking sector, and as a member of the joint SEC-CSE Committee for Digitalization of the Stock Exchange, he pioneered the regulatory framework for the country's first eKYC, which is now being used by predominantly most of the banks, insurance, and telco operators in Sri Lanka. From February 2019 to 2022, Mr. Fernando chaired the Data Protection Law Drafting Committee, leading and spearheading the experts basically with regard to the drafting of the first privacy law enacted in South Asia, consequent to 7 stakeholder consultations and public reviews. So, John, I think basically I hope I've done adequate justice in highlighting a few of the facets of Jayantha's achievements. Next, I would like to introduce Mr. Madhu Ratnayaka, co-founder and chairman of Skybers. Madhu is an accomplished technology executive with deep expertise in digital transformation, cybersecurity, and building high-performance global teams in high-tech and financial services companies. Madhu is the chairman of Skybers, a global cybersecurity consulting and managed services company. Prior to Skybers, Madhu was part of the executive leadership team that led Virtusa, a global digital engineering company, from startup stage right up to the 2 billion NASDAQ listed, being a listed corporation in NASDAQ, with over 30,000 team members scattered worldwide. As the global CIO, he led the establishment of Virtusa's award-winning digital platform and the industry-leading cybersecurity program. He also led the growth of Virtusa Sri Lanka's Advanced Technology Center from inception to the magnitude of 3,500 people as the center head. Prior to Virtusa, Madhu played multiple engineering and delivery leadership roles in telecommunications, petroleum, and consulting companies in the UK. Madhu is an independent director of Hatton National Bank. He is also the former chairman of SLASCOM, the industry chamber for IT BPO, and current advisor to the Cybersecurity Center of Excellence therein. Madhu plays a number of advisory and board roles for startups, universities, the government, and NGOs. Madhu has been recognized amongst the top 100 global leaders in technology, cybersecurity, and AI by the Technology Magazine UK and top 50 CIOs in India. We'll just move on to the next eminent speaker, Mr. James Webster. James joined New Dawn Risk in September 2019 to lead the technology, media, and cyber liability team. He spent the previous 5 years at Paragon International Insurance Brokers, another independent Lloyd's broker. Prior to joining the industry, James was a major in the British Army and served in Afghanistan and Iraq. He attended the Defence Academy of the United Kingdom, Royal Military Academy, Sandhurst, Newcastle University as a BA Honours degree in Chartered and a Chartered Manager at the Chartered Management Institute. James is a devout family man and an enthusiastic tennis player, in addition to his academic and professional accolades. Next, I move on to the other eminent speaker, Mr. Mohan Chaturanga. Mr. Mohan Chaturanga is a strategic leader in IT governance and data protection and heads the very vibrant and largest apparel manufacturer, textile manufacturer in South Asia, MAS Holdings, which has operations in 16 countries spanning 14,000 users. In a professional capacity, Mr. Chaturanga chairs the SLASCOM Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, working with cybersecurity companies, startups, education institutions, and has established export growth in cybersecurity for Sri Lanka. Mr. Chaturanga is a director membership of FITIS Professional Chapter, which is Isaka. In his previous roles, he has led multiple consulting services spanning data classification, protection, governance across government, banking, financial, and manufacturing institutions, and also a lead in many consulting organizations. He is one of the certified consultants in Sri Lanka for EU GDPR, which is to be implemented for Sri Lanka leisure sector. Being a thought leader in the consulting services domain, handling large-scale implementations with multinational consulting and engineering teams, he has a wide array of expertise. He has designed products basically and developed phishing campaigns basically, leading to training, has been recognized at the national level for best digitally enabled cybersecurity products. He is a published author in Indian journals on cyber sovereignty and privacy in Southeast Asia. Next, I would like to move on to the next panelist we have today, Erandika Kaushini Dayawansa, who holds the ACMA and CGMA and attorneys at law and LLB from the Open University of Sri Lanka, LLM from the University of Colombo, and currently who is pursuing her PhD at the Faculty of Law, University of Colombo, and studying at Cyber Insurance Academy. She heads the overall specialty line department, holding the position of Senior Manager of Specialty Lines of HNB General Insurance Limited. Further, Erandika counts nearly 2 decades long career span in the spectrum of corporate governance, compliance, accounting and finance, as well as in legal. Prior to joining HNB General Insurance Limited, Erandika served as a compliance officer of Asian Alliance Insurance, head of legal and compliance at Capital Life Holdings, assistant manager commercial lines, marine and energy at Haley's AIG, and the deputy manager liability as well. In an array of positions basically spanning alliance insurance to date. Erandika is well versed in the general insurance field, especially in the portfolios of directors and officers liability, professional indemnity, cyber insurance, corporate insurance solutions. She is a general insurance practitioner serving the insurance industry and its development with her knowledge. Last but not least, I would like to move on to the moderator of today's session. That's Mr. Nirmalan Nagaraja, who holds over 27 years of experience in the IT industry and serves as our president and board member of the FITIS Professional Consulting Chapter. He has held many C-level positions and currently serves as the CEO Principal Consultant of Kenvisa and serves also as an advisory Chief Process Officer for a multitude of clients. He is specialized and certified in global best practices, frameworks and business processes in the area of IT and management, and a contributor to the global practices, also serving in a multitude of global SME panels. His experience includes working with more than 200 plus organizations worldwide, including many global brands and giants and Fortune 500 companies covering several industry sectors. In addition, he has over 25 years of experience as a visiting faculty covering many university, undergraduate and postgraduate programs worldwide in the areas of IT and business management. He has also served many professional societies and industry associations, executive boards in various capacities, including the board director, honorable secretary, vice president, president, chairman, etc. He is a chartered fellow of the British Computer Society and also holds this charter and is also a CITP. So thus we have a very eminent panel with a wide spectrum of expertise. So I would like to advocate the audience basically to leverage in on the talent pool at hand with regard to demystifying some of the concerns you have with regard to moving forward in your endeavors to align basically towards the data protection regime in your organizations. In the interest of time, I would like to also appeal to all participants to send in any message, any questions you may have via chat, basically, so that the panelists could address them, time permitting, or else take it on as a follow-through to this session. So without any further ado, I would like to turn on the reins, basically, and hand over controls to our moderator, Mr. Nirmalan. Over to you, Nirmalan.
Thanks, Dinesh. Welcome everybody for the online discussion forum on future-proofing corporates for the data protection regime. Despite of many discussion forum conducted on data protection, I would request Jayanta Fernando to brief us what is this data protection is all about and why it is important specifically for our audience today.
Thank you, Nirmalan, and thank you very much, Dinesh, for organizing this discussion forum. I just realized that the introductions itself took a long time, and we have lost a significant amount of time through that process because we have such an eminent group of people. So, to cut a long story short, this was a significant legal policy enabling instrument that was long overdue, and during several consultations between stakeholders, especially in the banking financial services sector, in the context of promoting Sri Lanka as a destination for investment and to attract high-end digital investments around 2017-2018, the lacuna created by the lack of a data protection framework was flagged not only by the central bank, the then Governor Dr. Kumarasamy, but also by Securities and Exchange Commission, BOI, and Colombo Stock Exchange. So the necessity for this came about as a consequence of a series of discussions among stakeholders, both private sector and government. And I remember SLASCOM repeatedly called upon government and emphasized that this law is the missing policy component inhibiting or retarding their ability to grow and attract high-value clientele to Sri Lanka. In that context and in that background, we were given a mandate. The mandate came to us as a drafting committee in the first week of February 2019, and within a short span of 6 months, we were able to publish a framework document for public consultation. And as mentioned by Dinesh, this went through a rigorous public scrutiny process 7 stakeholder consultations, over 30 written submissions, both by domestic and international stakeholders. To emphasize on the international stakeholders engaged in the discussion, we must mention the Council of Europe Data Protection Committee, the European Union Justice and Consumer Affairs Directorate General has got a specialized division dealing with international data flows. The folks from that division were engaged in numerous reviews of this bill, as well as other international players, including large corporates, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and the amalgamation of all of them in the Asia Pacific arena, represented by AIC, Asian Internet Coalition, made a series of submissions on the bill at various stages, and we followed a different approach to the traditional legal drafting. Firstly, we could have waited for years until we recruited people on board to do this kind of a draft law. Instead of waiting for that, we used available resources with stakeholders, both in government and private sector, experts who were willing to volunteer time and whose employers were willing to release them for X number of days a week to get involved in the drafting process. So we had a public-private partnership, I would say, in the drafting process itself. That augured well because it ensured a lot of value addition from private sector on par with our traditional government legal folks who get involved in legal drafting. And in turn, we had a lot of inputs and interaction throughout the process. The second facet was that we published every single version, starting from the framework document published on the 16th of June 2019, right through the formulation of the bill, approval of the bill, and submission to Parliament. Every single version was published right through the process, which is not kind of done in other legislative drafting processes. So those were two unique factors I just want to flag. In terms of the key provisions, this law, I can go on discussing for hours the various provisions, but let me highlight a couple of key features. It has impact on both the government as well as private sector players who collect data. The governance of data both in government and private sector would be regulated by the Data Protection Act, and that's an important point to remember. There is a concept called a controller and a processor. Controller would be either a government or private sector entity that would collect personal data, and series of responsibilities have been entrusted on a controller. A processor would mean an entity hired by a controller to manage that data, and the relationship between the controller and processor is clearly defined. So there are responsibilities specified, including the obligations to fulfill certain functions. In terms of obligations, Part 1 has got the principles of lawful processing built in, including the principles requiring the data to be maintained with accuracy, limits on the time period for retention, integrity and confidentiality, and the basis for a privacy policy is very clearly articulated with reference to a schedule that describes the kinds of ingredients that should be there in a privacy policy going forward. So that is in Schedule 5 with reference to Section 11. But most importantly, there is a self-governing framework for organizations to look at in terms of how they would manage data to comply with this act, which is in section 12. We call it the Data Protection Management Program. What constitutes a Data Protection Management Program is something that we can discuss in Q&A. And all these principles are founded on standard deck you find within the framework of the European Union GDPR. So although ours is a soft law, certain principles have been brought in from GDPR. However, you would see elements which are not found in GDPR brought in here, namely the Data Protection Management Program came from laws and regimes more applicable in the APAC region, most notably Singapore and some other countries like that. That would ensure that companies would have the ability to manage effectively their control processes and governing measures to ensure compliance with this statute. Part 2 has a series of rights related to what data subjects like you and I could require controllers and processors to fulfill. The right to know what information entity has about us, the right to modify, right to update them, the right to erase in some instances, but remembering that these rights given to data subjects are not unilateral rights. A controller or processor can grant or refuse those rights subject to certain checks and balances to comply with other laws and retention obligations imposed under regimes under applicable law, such as the Right to Information Act, and so on and so forth. We have a specific provision governing review in the context of an automated decision made by a controller. That's in section 18. But most noteworthy is the fact that in terms of controller processor obligations, notwithstanding the parameters where DPO is required to be appointed, there are very clear criteria. So remember that every single company does not have to appoint a data protection officer. The requirement and instances where a DPO needs to be appointed is very clearly specified in section 20, right? And of course, we have very clear boundaries demarcating cloud hosting of personal data. So there was this debate to what extent companies and organizations could host personal data in cloud services. That whole issue was sorted out through this act. And in section 26, you see a lot of flexibility for private sector to host data outside Sri Lanka, subject to certain checks and balances to ensure compliance with this act. So, Nirbalan, I would close in there, but to say that the regulator under this act, part 5, there is a requirement to set up a separate independent regulator to regulate the provisions within the framework of this act and to set the minimum benchmarks. There is work in progress in that connection, remembering that there is a grace period for the implementation of this act, which is 18 to 36 months. Already 6 months have gone, almost 6 months have gone since the enactment of this act. So 18 to 36 months will come very soon. We cannot wait until that. But before the law is brought into operation, the new regulator has to be established. And the regulator is required by law to establish sectoral committees to prepare the necessary guidelines, which will be fed. And there's a requirement to have public consultations before rules are published. Another novel feature that you don't find in other regulatory frameworks. Closing on that point, Nirbalan, the regulator cannot immediately impose penalties and fines, but before doing so, can hold inquiries and issue directives parties violating the provisions of the Act to do course corrections, to rectify anomalies. And it is thereafter, if there is a further violation, that penalties would trigger in. But mitigation factors are also introduced in Section 39 to ensure checks and balances, and there is a right of appeal against the order of the new regulator. So those are some important facets. I'm sorry I rushed through some key features, but these are the salient facets we need to keep in mind. Remembering also that this is a soft law instrument. I say that because there are no criminal penalties accruing through this Act. It's all governed by an administrative law framework. And a lot of international experts looked at the provisions of this Act and have confirmed that ours is a model for the region, that it stands out because of the fact that we have borrowed principles, softened it, and applied it and domesticated it for our own purposes in line with international standards. Thank you.
Shanta, a quick question following that. You mentioned we are almost in line with GDPR. So if a company is already complied on GDPR, do they have to go through a major adaptation when it comes to Sri Lankan Data Protection Act? And what will happen if it is vice versa? We have already adapted Sri Lankan, and then what will be the deviation from GDPR?
Good question. So if you have met the very high bar in line with GDPR, you automatically comply with this Act. I can safely say that. And if you have complied with this Act, then I would say, on the converse, it's a stepping stone to become compliant with GDPR. Because the way this Act has been formulated, and in our discussions with the European Commission, Directorate General for Justice and Consumer Affairs, we had 4 rounds of extensive reviews, and they have confirmed to us in writing, most recently in March 2022, that this is the only law in this region that meets the minimum threshold points in line with the GDPR. I can safely say that. And they have invited the government authorities, once they establish the new regulator, to come on board to the European Data Protection Academy, so that there will be a synergy between the regulator here and the regulator in Europe, the European Data Protection Regulatory Board. To do that, we need to do a lot of training and competency development in the future regulator. But answering your point specifically, we fall squarely within the framework of GDPR, notwithstanding the fact that GDPR is a very high standard which has evolved over a period of 20 years, starting from the European Union directives, etc., over the years. Whereas in Sri Lanka, they are starting this from scratch, greenfield. So it will take years for us to reach the GDPR level of compliance in terms of national adoption. Nevertheless, we have the fundamental principles from GDPR into this Act, and they have confirmed that. So that's why I say, while GDPR compliant folks will be fully compliant with this Act, anybody, any country, any entity that is fully compliant with the Sri Lankan Act can eventually get to GDPR standard over a period of time, once the whole ecosystem in the country matures in the direction of having systems which are privacy by design, and so on and so forth. Thank you.
Thanks, Shanta. Quick, one more question to set the stage. What are the components, or what are the sections which is mandatory for us to comply immediately, and what is the time frame that we have?
we have to keep in mind, Nirbalan, the compliance obligations under this Act are not to be taken piecemeal. Please keep that in mind. So the starting foundational principles, I would think, comes from the fundamental principles for processing personal data in Part 1. So those are featured in Section 4 to Section 12. Keeping in mind, Section 12 is the accountability framework built around this concept we have built in here called the Data Protection Management Program. So 4 to 12 is a foundational piece in terms of compliance obligations. But moving on, we see controllers and processors would also have to comply with Part 3 of this Act. When we look at compliance generally, we can't take pieces piecemeal. It has to be compliant or non-compliant. If you want to have a compliance framework, it's better to map the broad framework of obligations stemming from this Act as the basis. On your second part, question about time frame, the way Section 1 is currently worded, starting from the date the speaker gave the certificate, it's 19th of March 2022, we have a grace period of 18 to 36 months. And already I said several months have run past. Of course, we had a lot of challenges. Nevertheless, the time frame is running. So 18 to 36 months would mean next year, October to end of 2024, when the relevant authorities, once the regulator is established, will determine the date when this Act will come into operation.
Thanks, Jayanta. This question basically for Madhu, Shan, and Mohan and James. Now, what do you think, Madhu, being in the security practice, what would be the difficulties that you see or foresee in implementing this practice in the organization, and how do you think that we can go about it?
Yeah, I hope you can hear me well.
Yeah.
So I think if you really go back to the genesis of what Jayanta mentioned, the real reason behind some of these data privacy act is that, increasingly our digital identities are becoming critical for our physical, everything that we do, right? So when your digital identity or digital footprint get compromised, as a citizen, you can have a serious implications, right? So I think if you really peel back the onion and think about why we are doing this, is two reasons. One, the data collected about citizens are used and used for appropriate reasons that they're collected for. So there is one responsibility that data collectors have, and then also to protect that, right? So it doesn't go out to hands either inadvertently or by choice to other parties. So those are kind of two principles if you really think about why we need, as countries become more digitally mature or dependent on digital, this becomes very critical, right? So as a company who is collecting data, I think there's two sides to it. One is, do you have the right practices in place to collect the data for only the reasons that we need to use it, and then have the right practices, processes in place to ensure that happens. Secondly, to protect the data so that doesn't, your data doesn't get compromised through a security breach or any other type of data breach that puts a data out. Right? So those are the primary focus areas you need to have in place. Now, if you think about implementation, I think it kind of breaks into few areas. The primary and first thing is to really understand what the data that you collect and being able to categorize and make sure that you have right processes and practices into address that. Most companies will find it challenging to know what personal data that you have in the company, right? You can have the data collected in your databases, in other forms. You may have data collected in some cloud systems. You may have data collected by employees on surveys and things like that. So first step is to really understand that, what data do you have about citizens, what PII data that you have, and there is technology out there to be able to figure that out and scan your environments and to make sure that you understand what you need to protect, right? I think the structured data is easy, right? You probably know that, and it's in a database. It's really the other data that you have to figure out how to identify them. Then once you identify, obviously you go through the process implementing the data protection controls that is required to make sure that's there. I think that's a second part, which is probably easier part in my mind, to once you know what you have and what you need to protect, and then put in the controls in place, right? Again, I think automation plays a huge role here, right? Because these as the volumes and the kind of data that you collect increases, it is going to be near impossible to do these things manually, right? And so that plays a big role in when you're implementing a control. The third point is around security, how to protect that, right? So you have your data, you identify, you have right controls in place to collect and manage it. Then you have to have a third layer is really about your data protection and cybersecurity program that you have in the company to make sure everything that you have in your custody is properly protected. So those are three areas I would say as you go to implement a proper data privacy and data protection program in your company that you need to think about.
Thanks, Madhu. Mohan, what do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I think that's a quite valid question, Nirmalan, because to add to what Madhu said, from our experience as an organization also, we took a 3-year journey to comply to GDPR. So that's a long time. But that's for a very limited number of consumers, because you are primarily in B2B business as our business, as the nature of our business. But if you look at the Data Protection Act for Sri Lanka, now we are looking at 100,000 of employee cadre, right, which is totally different. So as Madhu mentioned, scoping it out and identifying what are these data sets that we're trying to protect is going to be an enormous task for most of the organization, because most of the organizations have not yet, in the context of Sri Lanka, have not yet built in data governance frameworks yet to understand the concepts like data origin, the data lineage, where does the data come from. These kind of frameworks are yet to be established, even with a lot of B2C businesses, including banking and telco. So the nature of the architectures that the organizations are built in would not let you to identify these data sets in one single click, right? So it would need to do a bit of data discovery, understand where this data is, and if you look at the data protection as a whole, there are organizations who look at data protection from a IP to sensitive information of the organization from a different angle, where they have a hold and where they have certain identification there. But now when you take that back to the personal data, so that's a different domain that we're thinking of, whereas it's not only classifying and protecting, but it has certain elements where certain bit of processors need to work around. Example, data subject access rights, deletion to erasure to how do you work that piece out? Because it's not just technology, there is process and bit of transformation. So in terms of future proofing the organization, it's not only, I think, technology adoption which is required for data protection in terms of either your core data or personal data. There's a bit of transformation in the organization, technology landscape to process landscape, how you process that. Because I'll give you a few practical examples. If you look at some of the onboarding platforms that you see within the country, you would see there's a lot of personal information that's out there right on the onboarding or screening at level. But when you comply to certain data protection standards, you might not be taking all that information in. So that's a process transformation in HR, right? So these kind of different challenges will be there, which are not only technological, but these are process and organization oriented, which the organizations will face in company.
Thanks, Mohan. Quickly, Jayanta, Mohan used to have mentioned in few instances that employee HR. Now, does these employees fall under the data subject category by any chance?
Well, that's a straightforward question for me to answer. Reference point is to look at the definition of a data subject, and you see the definition of a data subject is broad enough to cover any individual. If we read the definition clearly, it's a very simple one. It talks of a identified or identifiable natural person, alive or deceased, in the personal data relates. Now, to keep in mind, the law is all about rights of individuals, right? And the individual rights are not specific to citizens of this country. Any person who deals with our system, deals with our companies, and as Mohan mentioned and as Madhu mentioned, data is transient. I mean, you are having companies and knowing what type of data sets you need to manage is crucial, because you may be a company having X number of employees, but those employees may be located in multiple jurisdictions. Now, irrespective of where a person is located, this law has sweeping cross-territorial impact. That's a point I think I didn't highlight earlier. So even those information you put into digital platforms will be regulated under this. So data subject, definitely employee would come within that framework, whilst employees may have certain rights. True enough, the controllers themselves, which is the employer, would also have certain rights within the boundaries of the policies and the standards and the contracts that employer hiring employees have signed up with their own clients. And company have to fulfill their obligations to their client, who are meeting the payment obligations, which in turn leads to the payment of employee salaries. So employees don't have unilateral rights here. We need to manage that expectation clearly. I face this question from a number of industrial organizations in more recent times and other employer federations. So we need to be mindful of the broader perspective.
Thanks, Jayanta. I think that should basically open up the corporates whom they think employees are not going to be falling into this category. Coming back to James. James, what do you think? How y'all in your region have practiced the implementation of GDPR, and what kind of issues that y'all have faced when y'all went through this implementation process?
Thank you very much. It's a very real pleasure to be here with you today. I think I come from a different perspective. I'm a Lloyd's broker. My business is is, and I just providing a little bit of background here. My business is focused largely on US clients, and then some in your region and some in Africa. But the majority of cyber business is driven by the US market. The reason why I mention that is because it's that environment that is driving a lot of the innovation and change, and has done for the last 10 to 15 years in this space. It was the regulators in America who were first onto data protection regulations, and continue to push for change, most recently in California. GDPR and the regulatory bodies in Europe have been catching up, as you well know, and it's now infiltrating across the globe. It's a very real issue, and I think the other panelists who've talked about the requirement to identify what data there is, categorize it as a starting point, I think is absolutely right. I think it's one of many issues from the insurance market's perspective, and Lloyd's continues to provide reinsurance and insurance to the tune of about 25% of the global cyber market, which our policies do cover GDPR fines and regulatory fines and penalties where applicable by law. It's a big player, and the direction of travel is this, I think. Insurers, yes, they want to know that their insureds understand what data they have, but the days of being asked to provide a PII count or a PHI count are pretty numbered, because the quantity of data is almost irrelevant. Businesses like yours are that you're processing, holding terabytes worth of data in many cases. So the quantity is not, it becomes almost irrelevant. It's about how you'll control it. Do you understand what you've got? Yes, well, that's a really important start. But then what are you actually doing with your data? So data retention, destruction policies, become really important. How are you segmenting your data? Where is your data held? Are there backups to your data? Are those backups tested on a regular basis? Have you war gamed? Have you sat down and thought about what you're going to do if your data is corrupted? So it really boils down to two things, I think. And the key takeaways here is, if you're taking your business and you're trying to provide and get insurance from our markets, it comes down to a combination of culture. So what does the governance look like of your business? Can you demonstrate that you've got a robust culture of doing the right thing or trying to do the right thing? And then second to that is obviously security controls, how you're actually implementing them, and can you demonstrate that you are doing as much as you possibly can and best in your class. So those are my thoughts on the subject. I hope that helps. Maybe I've killed the conversation. Come back and challenge me, ask me questions. I don't have all the answers. I think I'm coming from a different perspective, and I think it's important that you can challenge me on what I've just said.
Yeah, maybe while Nirmala joins, James, I think I do understand some of the areas, because I worked in the cyber insurance area, where actually when GDPR was enforced in 2018, and then you have the data scope, and the regulatory fines portion just skyrocketed in terms of the premiums, right? So when you have that applicable, so do you think that having local data protection, just out of curiosity, out of everyone's interest, who are working right now with the cyber insurances, who are looking for policies and who are already having policies, Do you think that having the local penalties would have an impact in terms of reinsurers' point of view in terms of the market?
Well, I think changes in local regulatory areas such as Sri Lanka, I think it demonstrates that the market is continuing to mature. And from a global insurer's perspective, I think that provides some level of comfort. If the local regulator is putting more attention on this and potentially fining businesses for not doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing, then I think that actually lends a lot of credibility to insurers exploring and offering more capacity to that marketplace. So I think it's actually a very positive thing. Now, in our business, regulatory fines that it's not what's necessarily driving premium today. The thing about cyber insurance is sort of ubiquitous and it's ever changing. The concern today has been business interruption losses or dependent business interruption losses as a result of third parties, and large organisations like your own are hugely dependent on all sorts of different vendors. That is something that the insurance industry is trying to grapple, understand how to quantify and price for that risk. Fines, penalties, regulatory, most businesses are mature enough now to understand what they've got and then lock it down pretty effectively. So it becomes less of an issue. What's tomorrow's concern is very difficult to actually understand or perceive or forecast for. The insurance policies went through 10 years of expansion of coverage because clients didn't necessarily see the value in cyber insurance because the losses weren't being attributed to them. That's really changed. In 2019, 2020, massive losses across US, Europe, Middle East. So you're going to start seeing a tightening of this has already happened in your market, a tightening of capacity and a tightening of terms and conditions. I think the regulatory fines penalties piece is there to stay. I think it's a portion of the insurance which has not really been impacted too much because regulators have taken time to explain to businesses in their environment where they're going wrong and then giving them opportunities to rectify that. So it hasn't been too much of a problem for the insurance market so far. Does that help?
Yeah, sure. Thanks.
Thanks, James. But I missed you all in between. Anyway, I'll come back to you once again. Kaushali, quick thing, you come from the insurance industry. Will you please tell us, our audience, how you will be able to support them in this perspective?
Yes, actually, insurance industry started providing cyber insurance for corporates for the risk which they will come across due to the cyber criminals, and mainly covering the first party losses which could arise due to data privacy, breach of data privacy, and business interruption, network interruption, and also the third party risk where the third party may sue the company for compromising their data. So the insurance industry provides cyber insurance. The Sri Lankan insurance industry, the companies are providing cyber insurance. However, I would say this is still at the infant stage because many corporates still have the dilemma whether they would go for a cyber insurance or whether should try to have their own cyber security tools tested and then implemented. but I would see that when it comes to the Europe, when it comes to the USA market, the markets have got really matured when it comes to the cyber insurance, and also like we need to get reinsurance support from overseas, and as a result, some of the stringent uh, underwriting tools would be applicable on our region as well. For example, compared to last year, in 2017, the reinsurance companies are more leveraged providing the ransomware coverage. However, I can see a trend where from last year onwards, they are restricting the ransomware coverage, which is coming on cyber extortion. So that is by the time we are ready to go for cyber insurance, I can see a trend where the reinsurance market is getting more tightened. Number one is due to the pandemic. Number two, due to the losses they have incurred at their part of the world. And number three is the war which is happening right now with Ukraine, Russia. So that is how I would see the cyber insurance. And there is a development for personal cyber insurance as well, but this is I would say this is still at the discussion stage. I saw a survey done by Swiss Re where they predict this kind of personal cyber insurance to kick off somewhere in 2025.
Yeah, thanks. Dinesh, can we have 10 more minutes additional, because looks like, we couldn't do a full coverage yet. James, you did mention that you do have issues the renewal and things like that getting reduced in terms of cyber insurance. My question is, now, Data Protection Act is mainly with customers, with the intention of giving customers more assurance and trust. Now, why do you have to go behind corporates? Because corporates have security programs set up very strongly, and that basically challenges the status quo of the security professional in the organization. Why can't you move with the clients directly, the customers directly? Where you think on that angle to give insurance? Because I feel that makes more sense, because the transparency of the organization cannot be challenged in most of the time by a normal client. So why you all basically focus on corporate? Is it because of the large chunk of payment which can be captured at once, or is it the cumbersome operation which you are thinking of?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Thank you for that. I think this boils down to a few things, but I think what we're talking about here is personalized cyber insurance and I think there are a number of carriers here in Lloyd's who have looked at this issue and have developed products in this space, and none of them are really taken off. And I think the reason being, and I've worked on a few of these programs to try and develop it in some way. I think the reason is that cyber insurance is much more about a service than it is than a promise or a piece of paper that's just a contract. The reason why insureds buy our cyber insurance is because they have a panel of experts to parachute in and help the IT security team in the event of something catastrophic. Now, I take your point entirely that corporates, IT security teams can quite rightly be a bit prickly about the issue of cyber insurance, because they would like to front load their IT budgets to cover off their security, and they're the best people in the business to do that. And then an insurance broker comes along and says, oh, you actually need insurance as well as your fantastic controls. So I can see that tension there. My comeback to that is that the threat vectors and actors are developing all the time, and so even if you have a very, very mature security operations, you can still suffer from cyber insurance attacks. So how does this directly link to your question? The problem with personal line cyber insurance is that in order to provide that level of response, breach response, in the event of an individual having their identity manipulated or losing their data, is really difficult to do. It's about a volume number, so it's difficult to make the economics of that work. It costs a lot of money to have a IT forensics team get involved. It costs a lot of money to have certainly in the States, a lot of money to have a privacy attorney involved in order to process whatever needs to be done in the event of a cyber incident. So I think it's an interesting question. I think there are products out there that have been developed and are yet to really take off, and I think that's the issue is the distribution of an effective and cost-efficient breach response.
Yeah, thanks, James. Coming back to Madhu, I'm sure you would have noticed during this pandemic, even banks, financial institutions calling and asking for your date of birth, most of the sensitive data, where you don't know where they are calling from. They claim they are calling from a bank, whereas the bank has outsourced this particular function to a different company. And you basically see these kind of things happening. So what do you think will be the situation if Data Protection Act comes into play? Will these conditions improve? Because they don't come through the normal channel, they come through various channels, which is a serious problem. You can't verify, right? You need to go back and forth in doing that, which is not a simplified process. So what would be the advice that you would like to give on this for the corporates which are doing this at this point in time to improve?
Yeah, good question, Irwan. I think this is it's not a local practice, it's a worldwide, right? You're using third parties to handle your customer service or handle processing of your KYC or onboarding. That's a global practice, right? Especially more digital banks come into picture and they are keeping their footprint very small and leveraging a set of partners to do it. I think this is where the Data Protection Acts like what we have in Sri Lanka as well as GDPR really provides a good framework, right? You have the data controller and the data processor, the relationships are very clear, and we have the framework to even in a global international setting to create those responsibilities and division of those responsibilities. I think it just strengthens the whole process, right? As it enables people to do more of this global processing and work across supply chain. Supply chain is a big part of these kind of enterprises, right? Whether it's a bank or insurer or any other company. And at the same time, obviously, supply chain risk becomes a huge issue as well, right? This is one of the most significant cyber risk today is a third-party risk or supply chain risk, right? Because your data is handled by, if you think about a bank, right? You're sending your entire customer data into a statement printing company, right? Who would just take that data and print it and post it, right? You think about the amount of data that goes out, and you have no idea about how that data is handled. So now with the GDPR and Data Protection Act in Sri Lanka, you will make both the data control and the data process a lot more responsible for it, a lot more accountable for it, right? And so in that sense, it will probably benefit the citizens and the people who our data is being shared, data subjects, as well as it creates more robust conversation and requirement for both the third parties as well as the enterprises to manage this data better. I think it will drive a better behavior, right? If you think about, you've seen a very significant uptake in third-party risk management around the globe, and we support a number of customers in that area. They're really understanding third-party risks, understanding how third parties handle the data that you provide them, or the data collect on behalf of you from customers. It's maturing quite rapidly. That's what we see right now.
Thanks, Madhu. Mohan, what do you think? What would be the data that you would be expecting from a audit and governance perspective from these corporates to collect?
Yeah,
In support of this.
Yeah, so in terms of audit and governance, the first thing is that the data protection implementation should be a framework and a methodological one for audit or assurance framework to be built around it. So that's why most of the organization takes an approach of building a PIMS or a personal information management system like BS 10,000 or 27701, these kind of frameworks to come into the play and create these kind of methodological ways. So there are processes, there are SOPs, there are mechanisms, DPI is done, things like that. So someone can come back and test whether the controls are effective or not. And here the organizations, what need to consider right now is, if you want to future-proof the organization from a data protection point of view, sometimes what you need to look at is the risk point of view. So if you look at a business like us, B2B, so if you say GDPR is applicable to us for a certain extent, and the worst penalty that you're looking at is a 4% of your annual turnover, and maybe we are holding top-end high-fashion customers' data, which if that breaches, that customer goes off, we are looking at a 25% drop in revenue for the business. So the data protection has a larger portion apart from the fines and some of the perspective that you bring through legislation. But that gives the enforcement and the drive for organization to build trust, right? So that is what organization would be looking at. Even if you look at bank, it's not the fine that drives, it's the loss of trust. Even if you look at telco, it's the same. So audit and assurance framework should be geared enough to understand how strong is the risk management perspective around data protection of the organization works. So whereas what's the accountability around board of directors? Are they taking this serious enough? What's that framework? Then is there an organization hierarchy built around this to support the organization to manage that particular risk, which will have a direct revenue impact in the long term? So not just data being leaked. Then once you operationalize it, there'll be SOPs, frameworks, what IT does, what HR does, what rest of the organization does in terms of data protection, in line with compliance and regulatory point of view, plus the core data protection of the organization. So building your framework, operational framework in line with the already established standard, number one for audit and governance. Number two is risk management is also very well intervened with the management practices. I think those are two important things in those aspects.
Okay. Dinesh, is there any questions from the audience? Dinesh, are you there?
None, Nirmala.
Okay, fine. So I can go at least one more question.
Yes, please.
Yeah. So this is an open question to everybody. With the move of digital transformation, a majority of the organizations inviting application to be connected offline in multiple forms. So, which basically triggers a need for zero trust. Now, in this case, how would your personal information management is going to change, and what kind of impact do you think that's going to have on this? Madhu or Mohan or James, anybody would like to?
Yeah, I'll give a quick view on that one, Nirmal, to start with. When you build zero trust, is that the organization's particular environment is based on zero trust. You don't trust anyone. So, but the organizations that Madhu mentioned are quite complex in nature when you consider the supply chain. So it's almost all the services and data sets are now open. You look at open APIs, you look at integrations. That's how you build collaboration and partnership in terms of expansion. And that is also across the globe now, right? So when you look at things like that, when you build zero trust architecture, that gives you, if you actually build zero trust architecture in your infrastructure, that gives a lot of trust for you. That means even your supply chain is going to be quite scrutinized and very well established certain defenses. It requires a lot of investment in terms of building zero trust from a application to architecture transformation point of view as well. But zero trust is, I think, is a must when you embrace data protection, because it is extremely difficult when you don't build zero trust kind of architectures to control the data flow, where it goes. And as a controller, how you take care of processes, it's not just contractual, but technically how you do that. So that's going to be challenging, and zero architecture is it's a great important piece in my point of view.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to add a little bit to that, if you really go back to the zero trust principles, right, there are key three principles based on, right? The first one is called verify explicitly. Any access to the data or any API or any asset or resource that you have, you're building very granular control verification program, right? So that's really the kind of foundation of zero trust, because you don't trust anybody. Like typical security says, okay, once you come into your corporate network, you trust everybody inside the network. Outside that network, you don't trust, right? That's trust at a more granular level, right? When in a zero trust environment, you trust at an asset level, and you verify at an asset level. So the trust is established every single time you're trying to access an asset, right? That's the first one. The second one is called least privilege, right? Where you give the least possible privilege required to use that asset, so that you don't have undue privileges out there, which is generally get exploited when somebody have access to you. So that's the second kind of principle that drives zero trust. And the last one is assume breach. Assume that you will get breached, and make sure that you do things like encryption, backup, and stuff like that, so you protect the data and protect the resources, and also have ability to recover very fast. So this is the kind of the foundation of zero trust architecture, right? These three principles. And when in respect to data privacy and data security, it's very foundational, as Mohan was saying. This really drives, and that's where the industry is moving, right? More and more companies are adopting zero trust principles and zero trust architecture in terms of trying to protect their critical or crown jewels that they have, right?
James, you want to chip in anything? Anything from the region or from the part where, like, currently it is being done practically?
No, I don't think I've got anything else to add, particularly on that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Right. I think because of the interest of time, we have to wind up. I'm sure we should extend this discussion for another maybe 2 more parts. We have a lot to discuss. There are a lot of things which we need to throw out, but I don't think we have sufficient time now in any form to even cover the small portion of it. So maybe we can think of looking at part 2 and part 3. So before we close, what would be your final thoughts on this. So, each one can give a final thought on this, thinking the corporate environment, the people who are looking at it for implementation.
So I'll go first. Then I think my thought is that we you have a little bit of time, so get started early, right? And I think this is really all about managing your personal data that you collect about your customers, your stakeholders in a responsible way and protecting it, right? It makes a lot of good business sense, right? And with the increase in cyber risks and cyber attacks, you at some point will get compromised, right? So it's not whether you get compromises or when you're going to get compromised, right? So it's very important that you start putting the safeguards in place, really use the time that is available from a compliance perspective without having to wait till the last minute to really put this in place, right? It takes a while. It's a change in culture, change in your organization practices, processes. It's not going to happen overnight, right? It requires a leadership backing, support from board, and that kind of a top-down support and demanding of this, right? So my suggestion to corporates, especially in Sri Lanka, is to start early and really put significant priority around that. As your business becoming more digital, this is something that you can't look at lightly.
Yeah, thanks, Madhu. What about Mohan?
Yeah, so I think the message here is that the data protection, privacy, all these need to be fundamental values that an organization is built on. So how we adapted it ourselves is that we have the vision of enriching lives and enabling dreams. So if we won't be able to enable dreams for anyone, that if we are not cautious about their data and their privacy, so that's how we connect data privacy implementation to our vision, organization vision. So I think if you can start there, how you make privacy and data protection as part of your DNA in an organization, you start there, then get external help, talk to experts, and build a framework around it, and start early, and we'll be good.
Yeah, Mohan, thanks. That emphasize, keep customer in mind, wear the customer's shoes, right? Yeah, what about James? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I'd just echo what Mohan just said. I think it's a combination of culture and security controls. If you find yourself that in a position where you think insurance is going to be an important part of your future proofing, then make sure you can demonstrate your culture and have high levels of security, obviously.
Yeah, thanks, James. What about Kaushani?
Yes, I would like to quote from Art of War Sun Tzu's. It says, if you know the enemy and know yourself, you need not fear the result of 100 battles. And if you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. So when it comes to data privacy law, cyber, I would say the second one is the most effective, because if you know yourself, say you have implemented all the cybersecurity tools in the organization, but still you are missing. You don't know your enemy. In that case, the risk transferring mechanism, the cyber insurance comes into place, and we are here to help you. So that's my message.
Yeah, good insight, Kaushani. Janta, finally, back to you.
Yeah, okay. So let me have a final say, taking a cue from what Kaushani said. We have to manage that battle. We have an instrument now called the Data Protection Act. I'm not so effective in marketing this. My marketing stamina is all gone in justifying this for many years, right? So now it's up to all of you guys to work as stakeholders to support the implementation. And I just want to acknowledge Nirmalan in conclusion, the role FITIS and all of you guys, not to mention my good friends here, Madhu, Dinesh, Kaushini, a student of mine, to many others in this forum who worked as true partners in a public-private partnership atmosphere to make this happen. But I just want to mention one important facet, not just from a corporate perspective, but in general, it is relevant for corporates as well. This instrument called privacy data protection is an important facet in the whole trust ecosystem. We had many laws. Sri Lanka was the first to enter the Budapest Cybercrime Convention in the region. We have a sound electronic transactions legal regime. All that is there, but this was the missing piece that enhances trust in the ecosystem, providing a framework for customers to have confidence to use digital products and services that all of you develop. In that context, I just want to flag a point which many of you may need to work more on, Nirbalan, and maybe you in particular when you look at the next two phases. Capacity building in-house as well as within the consulting organizations. Not, well, it can extend to those providing risk management, as James and Kaushini pointed out. In that whole ecosystem, capacity building to support this whole endeavor to enhance trust through privacy management tools. There are new facets in zero trust, which we know there are new standards coming in, guidelines, industry standards. There's the Gartner Carta. NIST has come out with their 800-227. There are a number of new ways, technological innovations that have come in this direction to set the standards so that we could have a cloud-first work from anywhere framework. So in that context, it's important to know that capacity building is a big area that needs to be addressed, which is not being addressed in companies big, medium, small. And I just don't want to touch on government entities because there's a lot of lacunas in those entities. So with that note, I'll just say once again, thank you, Dinesh and Kirbalan and all the panelists for a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Jayanta. Just to add to that, we have done a discussion forum on an international panel poll, especially on digital trust and customer experience, basically focusing on customer perspective of all these. So we will definitely look into that and see how we could enhance that further. Thank you all those who have tuned to us today, and thank you very much for all the panelists. I will pass it to Dinesh, and the panelists will hold on for a few minutes after the audience leaves.